Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's great to be here. The last time I used slides was, I think, at the last Samuel Griffith conference down in Melbourne, so we'll see how this goes. I can only assume, given that I've been put after Horton QC and my old pupa master Reynolds SC, that I am the light entertainment for the afternoon. A little over a month ago in New South Wales, 3 climate change activist groups started conducting a range of protests that did not aim to interfere with coal exports or activities linked to the subject matter of their protests, but instead sought to interfere with freight handling at Port Botany and vehicle traffic on major thoroughfares like the Harbour Bridge and the Sprit Bridge. The objective was maximum disruption to modern life and to impose the protesters' point of view on the whole of the community. These protests exposed a number of issues which I'd like to examine with the conference today. The first was the existence of a legal loophole that the New South Wales government quickly shut by passing a bill to amend the Roads Act and the Crimes Act to create offences for certain behaviour that causes disruption or damage to major roads or major public facilities. But the reaction of the left to that legislation raised further questions warranting investigation. The questions include, was there any justification in a tolerant, free democracy for the disruptive protests of this kind? And was there any credible justification for the political support that these protesters received from the left of New South Wales politics and its opposition to the actions taken by the New South Wales government? My thesis today is that the modern left does not understand either the meaning nor respect the importance of free speech. Inherent in the socialist objective, whether it be Marxist socialism or far-right National Socialism, is totalitarianism. With totalitarianism comes the suppression of any expression which is in opposition to the ideological socialist vision. A corollary of that involves the endorsement of any action, however chaotic and disruptive, that furthers the ideological vision. Today I will start with an explanation of the mechanism to facilitate lawful political protest in New South Wales. Then I'll examine what happened with the Roads Amendment legislation in New South Wales and its exposure of the inconsistent approach by the left to free speech. Then, if time permits, I'll quickly give an overview of some of the philosophical rationales for the importance of free speech and expose the inherent tension with leftist ideology. I hope to be able to come to an inevitable conclusion that the modern approach of the left to free speech boils down to a simple proposition. Free speech is important if they agree with the subject matter, no matter how much chaos that involves. But if the left opposes the substance of the matter expressed, then the free speech should not occur, no matter how benign the disruption. It's a tough audience. Prior to 1979, public assemblies were governed almost exclusively by the common law. The offences of riot, affray and the like were the main tools to deal with unlawful and disruptive public protests. The Rand Labor government, back in an era when the left were more comfortable supporting free speech, introduced the Public Assemblies Act of 1979, which offered a legal shield in certain circumstances to protect protesters from police action against protests. These provisions and other dealing with the law of public assembly and protest were consolidated by the Liberal Greiner government in Part 4 of the Summary Offences Act 1988, which remains in force today. Part 4 allows for a process whereby a public assembly can be authorised through an application to the Commissioner of Police under Section 23. The application is required to state the time, place, date and proposed route of a protest procession and places where it's proposed that it will stop, the purpose of the public assembly and how many people are expected to attend. The notice is signed by a person who takes responsibility for organising and conducting the proposed public assembly. Under Section 24 of the Act, If the public assembly is authorised by the police and conducted substantially in accordance with the particulars furnished, a person is not by reason of anything done or omitted to be done by the person for the purpose only of participating in the public assembly will be guilty of any offences relating to participation in an unlawful assembly or the obstruction of any person, vehicle or vessel in a public place. The Commissioner of Police, the Commissioner of Police may apply to a court for an order prohibiting the holding of a public assembly if the notice was served 7 days or more before the date specified in the notice. The Commissioner of Police may not apply to the court if the organiser requests to mediate with the police and the Commissioner is required to take into account matters put by the organisers before applying to the court. Justice Adamson noted in New South Wales Commissioner of Police and Folks that the word prohibit in section 25 of the Act is inapposite since a prohibition order under section 25 does not prohibit the holding of a public assembly at all, nor does the Act make it an offence to hold or participate in a public assembly or procession that has not been authorised. All the making of a prohibition order does is deprive the participants in the public assembly of the additional protection that it affords by section 24 if the assembly is held substantially in accordance with the notice. However, even if police and protesters do not cooperate together to provide for an authorised public assembly, if the notice is served on the police 7 days prior and the Commissioner has not yet authorised the public assembly, the organiser may apply to the court for authorisation of the public assembly in the Commissioner's place. Courts are required to expeditiously decide any issues required of the courts under the Act. The Act does not speak to the criteria allowing or prohibiting the additional protection granted to protest by Part 4. However, Justice Hidden offered a particular pithy statement in Commissioner of Police and Ridgewell that a series of decisions of judges of this course have established that the power to make the order involves the exercise of a broad discretion, balancing the undoubted rights of free speech and assembly against the competing rights of other citizens, such as the right to unimpeded pursuit of their affairs, together with the interests of the community in maintaining public order. Now, in practice, this regime works very well. Few protests are refused by the police outright. In fact, we saw a recent example in Bassey and the Commissioner of Police, where a Black Lives Matter protest involving 20,000 people was allowed in the middle of a pandemic by the Court of Appeal. It was conducted relatively peacefully, and that is a testament to the freedom of expression and protest that we generally enjoy in this state. Now, of course, legislation in this area is somewhat fraught because, as you no doubt know, over the last 30 years, the High Court has worked itself into knots to imply a freedom of political, a freedom of political speech within our federal constitution, and then try to work out what that actually really means in practice. Now, I could go into more detail on that issue, but in the interest of time, I will, I think I've gone ahead of myself here. I will simply note Justice Stewart's recent remarks in Liberty Works in the Commonwealth. The division within the court over so important an issue may justify a reconsideration of the implication itself. In that respect, it's one thing to proclaim the necessity of a freedom of political discourse given the type of representative and responsible government created by the Constitution. It's another thing to entirely to make an implication about when and how that freedom may be legitimately limited. The notion of an implied right to freedom of political expression in our Constitution is, to use the language of the late, great Roddy Marr, nothing less than a legal heresy. The framers of the Australian Constitution clearly and intentionally omitted a Bill of Rights in the Australian Constitution. with the effect that the judiciary would not be the guardian of that omitted. The framers' attitude to limiting government legislative power by entrenching freedoms was expressed by Sir John Cockburn, who said during an attempt to include aspects of the Fourth Amendment of the US Constitution into our Constitution, effectively that this would be an insult to the legislatures of our country to think that such a Bill of Rights was necessary. Chief Justice Mason acknowledged in the Australian Capital Television case, which commenced this 30-year legal heresy, that the framers of the Constitution accepted in accordance with the prevailing English thinking that the citizens' rights were best left to the protection of the common law in association with the doctrine of parliamentary supremacy. And, quote, it is difficult, if not impossible, to establish a foundation for the implication of general guarantees of fundamental rights and freedoms into the Constitution. Sadly, after acknowledging the impossibility of the task, he then participated in the butchering of the process. The High Court says, of course, that implied freedom of political communication is not an individual right, and so on. An analysis of that jurisprudence would involve more time than I have today, so I'm going to leave it there. Moving now to the Roads and Crimes Legislation Amendment Act of 2022, prior to only a few weeks ago, heavy fines in New South Wales were only in place for trespassers upon a limited category of some only of our bridges and tunnels in New South Wales. The penalty for those trespassers was 2 years imprisonment, a $22,000 fine, or both. However, the exact same conduct with the exact same disruptive effect upon other key infrastructure like ports, major roads, or bridges and tunnels not covered by the Roads Act did not attract that same reasonable penalty. In fact, under the Summary Offences Act, one penalty for certain offences was only $1,000 fine or 3 months imprisonment, and in respect of other matters, it was no term of imprisonment and fines between as little as $440. The inadequacy of penalty, recently exposed by reason of a concerted program of intentional climate change protests, which caused great disruption, involved people tying themselves to cranes at Port Botany, climbing on cargo trains, sitting down in front of oncoming traffic, gluing themselves to the road, and setting off flares on top of trucks parked in the middle of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Emergency services had to risk their own safety to rescue the protesters. The public was blocked from using the roads and bridges that had been paid for by their taxpayer dollars, and in some cases even paid by a toll that they had paid that day. The protesters could have followed the process under Part 4 of the Summary Offences Act that I've already referred to, but the protesters declined that opportunity. Of course, not all protests and acts of political speech follow the letter of the law. There is a tradition of non-violent direct action against injustice. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, is one such case in point. However, I think it's fair to say that the climate change protests that we're talking about are a long way from convincing white people in Mississippi in the 1950s that racial segregation was a bad idea. Children today are taught in schools about climate emergency, and our public and private broadcasters use every opportunity to advocate for climate change. Martin Luther King Jr. certainly didn't swing from any cranes or glue himself to any roads. He marched with his supporters in a manner permitted in our free democracy by the Part 4 of the Summary Offences Act. These climate change protesters were defying the rule of law, similar to Sally McManus, who told Lee Sales in that famous 7:30 interview that she only believed in the rule of law so long as she considered the law was reasonable. So the New South Wales Government acted to protect the rights of our citizens to move freely, not to be obstructed in public places, and to receive white goods, furniture, food and other items delivered to Port Botany. The government moved legislation in Parliament to allow it to make regulations to prescribe trespassers on all bridges and tunnels in Greater Sydney. The government expanded an existing offence under Section 144G of the Roads Act to prohibit people from entering, remaining on, climbing, jumping from, or otherwise trespassing on all major roads, not just bridges and tunnels, if that conduct causes damage to the bridge or tunnel or seriously disrupts or obstructs vehicles and pedestrians. The government's also amended the Crimes Act to make an equivalent offence preventing such conduct. Both of the amended offences and the new offences carried maximum penalties of $22,000, 2 years imprisonment, or both, to bring all of the same conduct, regardless of where it occurred, in conformity with the same penalty. Now, the government didn't censor the protesters' message because the New South Wales government, like the vast majority of Australians, believe that people should be able to express their point of view. Labor left and the Greens were furious about the legislation. Quote, "The right to protest comes with a right to cause disruption," close quote, said one Green MLC. This was an apparent reformulation of the Declaration of Independence. She believes in life, liberty and the pursuit of disruption. Quote, "There's no such thing as an illegal protest," close quote, tweeted another Greens MP. The Greens framed the bill as the government raising the penalties for peaceful protest. They argued the bill was seeking to criminalise the behaviour of people who are trying to save us and improve our world. On the parliamentary record, the Greens voiced their objection. There is no urgency to the bill, ignoring the ongoing chaos caused by the protests and the legal loophole that facilitated them. The Labor opposition is joining the government and is complicit in rushing the law through, they complained. Whilst it is possible to describe blocking traffic and endangering the lives of emergency services workers required to remove a protester swinging from a crane as peaceful because it was non-violent, such conduct risks harming others unnecessarily, particularly when there is a clear established protest for having your protest heard with police or judicial support and protection in New South Wales, as has been already described. The issue for the government was not the message of these protesters, it was the conduct of the protest. But that was not an issue for the left of politics. Yet the Greens, while complaining about the speed of the bill to pass Parliament, sought to frame the bill as one about peaceful protest. I do not think anyone would agree that this is a good process or is necessary. To make it perfectly clear, nothing in the bill will in any way prevent peaceful protest in the state. That's an interesting statement, given that there's no consideration that a $22,000 penalty or a fine would be the sort of a deterrent to prevent peaceful protest or protest. It would just increase the penalties so that people engaging in what the government defines as illegal protest would be fined $22,000 or imprisoned for 2 years. This is the legislation that members will be waiting around this evening to pass. I was here till very late last night and I'm absolutely determined to see that we can do all we can to disrupt the bill. So interestingly, disruption of parliamentary process is also seen as a legitimate tactic. Labor's reaction was also interesting. Challenged by the Greens, who declared they were not an opposition that stood for the right of people to suspend themselves from cranes and disrupt traffic, Labor could not remain quiet. As the end of the MP's speech, a Labor MP shouted out in solidarity, "I fight Tories too." That was the Labor left's priority here, to be seen to be fighting Tories, not standing on the side of the community. Caught between the need to kowtow to militant trade union protesters and the need to appease the left wing of their party, Labor grudgingly decided to support the Coalition's legislation, but to try and move amendments to appease the left. Labor successfully moved amendments to privilege the same disruptive conduct by their primary constituent, military trade unions. They sought to amend the legislation to allow protests by employees at workplaces and other related industrial action. Both Labor and the Greens sought unsuccessfully to make an amendment such that the legislation would have been completely rendered nugatory. They wanted to say that so long as you peacefully hang from a crane at Port Botany, you should be exempt from the new penalties. The government successfully opposed the amendments that both Labor and the Greens sought to exempt what they deemed peaceful protest from any sanction. Given the need to urgently pass the legislation, the government supported and did not stand in the way of the earlier amendments with regard to industrial action. The response to these pieces of legislation offer a stark contrast with the response of the same members of Parliament to the Public Health Amendment Safe Access to Reproductive Health Clinics Bill in 2018. These laws were a reaction to protests mainly in Albury rather than Sydney or elsewhere in New South Wales by Christian groups, certain Christian groups, outside a private abortion clinic. A majority of Australians, including myself, would support the right for a woman to have an abortion, but the Safe Access to Reproductive Clinics Act went much further and was designed to prevent the public expression of a point of view in certain very expansive terms and activities. You will see that the Section 83C was not limited to the type of protest or the subject matter of the protest. It was cast in the most broad terms. Any conduct which could be deemed to be harassment, intimidation or the like was caught by the legislation. And indeed, a reproductive health clinic where the prohibited actions were allowed to take place was also in the broadest possible terms. For example, it would conform to any private or public hospital of a general kind, not just an abortion clinic in New South Wales. And there's another problem. How would you know if the person who was entering a public or a private hospital was to go within the reproductive clinic or not of the premises? How would you know that you were committing a breach of the law? Oops, sorry. And the penalties, as you will see, were significant. For a first offence, $5,500 or 6 months imprisonment. For a second or subsequent offence, $11,000 or 12 months imprisonment. The conduct that upsets or I'll withdraw that. And as I said in my speech in Parliament when this legislation was introduced, it was curious that it would prevent any industrial action outside of a hospital. Yet the Labor MPs were completely in support of the legislation. And unlike the Roads and Crimes Bill, the left raised no concerns about its effect on its core constituency, the trade union movement. Unlike the Roads and Crimes Amendment Act that we passed a few weeks ago, no Greens MLC or MLA came forward to say that the right to protest comes with a right to cause disruption, as they did a few weeks ago. No Greens MP said there's no such thing as an illegal protest. In fact, the same Green MPs who said there's no such thing as an illegal protest with regard to the recent roads legislation said on the abortion exclusion zones, quote, "The right of freedom to protest and to peacefully assemble is something that I will always protect. But there's no article in the United Nations Convention that enshrines the right to harass or intimidate women." Now, can I just say that having spent 2 weeks on pre-poll in southwest Sydney for the 2019 state election, surrounded by trade union officials, when we had a female candidate, that the idea that the left does not engage in harassment or intimidation of right-wing women is completely incorrect. The Liberal candidate in that case was shouted over, pushed, blocked, and there was all kinds of harassment and intimidation that took place on that occasion. It's just that they didn't agree with that person, so that was okay. Another Greens MP said about the abortion exclusion legislation that her mind was boggled by the comparator with protests. I would assume from her point of view that it was okay to protest peacefully if she agrees with the protest, but as soon as she doesn't agree with the subject matter of the protest, no matter how peaceful and respectful it is, then that was illegal if it was within the vicinity of a reproductive clinic. And of course, the physical restrictions on that legislation, 150 metres from a reproductive clinic, is incredibly problematic. 151 metres is okay, but 149 metres isn't okay. That means, for example, according to this map, if you're at the intersection between Hunter Street and Elizabeth Street from an abortion clinic across the road from Parliament House, that's okay. But it wouldn't be okay if you were 93.75 metres and conducted a protest outside the ministerial offices in 52 Martin Place. That's actually illegal. It will be illegal to intimidate or harass anyone outside my ministerial office under this legislation. 6 months imprisonment and a fine is the potential penalty. So I'd simply make the point, I'm just conscious of time, free speech clearly does not mean anarchy. Sedition, fighting words, laws of defamation and so on have long been considered legitimate reasons to limit free speech in our community. And there are many reasons for why that is the case, and I think it gives an insight into why the left finds this so problematic. One of the great thinkers in the Western tradition is, of course, John Stuart Mill. And he really couches the argument in favour of free speech as being very much one of a free market of ideas. Now, we know that the left hate free markets of any kind, and especially ones involving ideas. And John Stuart Mill said that the problem with interrupting the collision of ideas is that it has two effects. The first is the obvious effect, which is to stop the person involved from expressing their ideas, regardless of whether that idea is good or bad. But the secondary effect is that by driving those ideas underground, you actually deprive the alternate view from being able to collide with that idea and explain why that first idea is wrong. And then the bad ideas are, as a consequence, driven underground, where people have echo chambers. Maybe they're not always driven underground if there's an echo chamber. And there is no true engagement, there is no advancement of human thought, and there is no rising above simple opinions, unchallenged echo chamber type opinions. It is undesirable that inferior ideas are allowed to exist without challenge. Truly racist ideas, for example, is a good case in point. Rather than political correctness driving poor and vile words underground, as we have now in our community, They should be challenged and told why they're wrong, in my opinion. Since everyone's been speaking about Hayek today, I'll just give you the benefit of a quote also by him as to this idea of totalitarianism and thinking that he expressed in The Road to Serfdom. And he also pointed to Sidney and Bertrice Webb, British socialist observers to the socialist Soviet system, who remarked that whilst the work is in progress, any public expression of doubt or even fear that the plan will not be successful is an act of disloyalty and even treachery because of its possible effects on the will and of the efforts of the rest of the staff. So this idea of totalitarianism, that you can't afford to have a contrary point of view. So in conclusion, I've endeavoured to demonstrate by some real-world examples the conflicting approaches to free speech between the left and what I would term liberal thought. The left cannot countenance any critique of their policy position, even if the policy position runs counter to organised Labor's interests. This is why Labor MPs will not provide special protections to union protesters in a bill designed to favour access to reproductive clinics, but will provide special protection to trade unionists in other contexts, like anti-anarchist legislation, to deal with roads and critical infrastructure. This is why the Greens will say they support free protest, but label free speech against their interest as harassment and intimidation, ignoring the possibility that the protests on their side can also cause harassment and intimidation. Free speech in our society is obviously very important. More than ever, we need a collision of ideas rather than the degradation of public policy debate that we see today. However, anarchy is not to be confused with argument. I hope that my paper today will help to promote an understanding of the difference between the two. Thank you.